Welcome to the Painting Insights podcast. We have been working on something in the background.
That's right. We've actually started a Patreon channel. For the last couple of months, we've had previous guests revisit the channel to give us additional content, everything from studio tours, sketchbook tours, talking us through the process of paintings and all kinds of additional treats, which you're exclusively going to see as a patron who supports the channel.
So by supporting us on Patreon, you help the channel keep going. There's a lot of work put into this, from the video editing to the sourcing of guests. So you really help us find those guests and to put the content out.
And we have lots of content planned for the near future. So the links for that will be in the description of this video and in the description on the podcast channels. And otherwise, you can go on to Patreon and type in Painting Insights Podcast and support us that way. Thanks very much. Enjoy the video. So could you introduce yourself for the audience, please?
Well, I'm David Shevlino. I am a painter from the US. I'm a figurative / portrait painter, I guess is how I would characterize myself most of the time.
Yeah, but I've seen that you also do landscapes really well, like beautiful landscapes and some still life as well. Am I correct? Yeah.
That's right. I do paint landscape and still life. I say portrait and figure because that's primarily what I paint, and I'd say figure. I'd say the figure is my first love. That's what I'm most comfortable with, and I love figure painting.
How long has it been that you've specialized in portraiture and figure painting?
Oh, that's a good question. I'd say for the better part of my career. I did a lot of figure drawing when I was in school in the 1980s, and directly after school, I started doing plein air painting, mostly because I did not have access to the models that I had in school. So I started doing plein air painting because, as well as still life, because I didn't have the money I couldn't afford to hire my own models.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I ask is because unless I'm mistaken, I don't usually consider people to be as well versed at landscape if they only do figure painting or portraiture. Landscape they usually struggle with, and I can tell by your landscape painting it's not something that you struggle with. You know that well. You do that beautifully, and it appears to me that you've got a specialization because it's obviously a passion of yours, but you also have this ability to do, turn your hand to whatever you'd like, really.
I did spend quite a bit of time doing plein air painting, and I think I've come to the realization that the time I spent doing that was very beneficial because, or in other words, I learned a lot from plein air painting, and a lot of what I learned I've taken with me into the studio. And although landscape painting is very different than figure painting, some of what I learned has a lot to do with inventing and not getting too precious about, or let me put that into context. So as a landscape painter, as a plein air painter, I learned that you really couldn't be precious about or too fussy about the fact that things are they're constantly changing when you're outdoors painting. The light is changing, the sky is changing, that sort of thing. And so because of that, I started to invent a little bit. I would work on a landscape outdoors. Then I would bring it back to the studio and I'd finish it up mostly from memory, and inventing a little bit. And those things have served me well as a figure painter or as a studio painter, as far as uh, just making if I have to make things up and I have to invent a little bit. I think they were good lessons that I learned as a plein air painter.
Was this out of art school you had this confidence, or did it take a while? Because I feel as though those artistic liberties that we take to serve the piece over the reality is something which takes experience and confidence. So I'm wondering, when was it that you actually acquired that decision-making ability?
Actually, it took a little while. Right out of art school, I wouldn't say I had that kind of confidence. I don't know if I could give it an exact number as far as how many years, but it did take a while. It took many years, but with time, I became more confident about what I could do and how I could do it. But that's a good question, because the confidence to be able to do something is really integral, or not just in the creative arts, but in much of life. But as I said, it took a while. It did not come very quickly or easily for me.
But do you remember, was it as a result of reflecting on the limitations of time and the ability to render a plein air painting with the shifting light? Or like, how do you remember anything about, this is where I started to invent?
Well, I can remember with time, when I first began plein air painting, there was a learning curve because I was very new to it. I didn't do any plein air painting when I was in school. But I remember, with time, it started to become, feel a little more natural for me. And, eventually I guess I had a sort of aha moment, as if to say, oh, okay, this is what it's like to be outdoors and to be painting a subject like this. It's not like when you're in front of a model in a controlled environment, but out here, you're having to, not only is the light changing and things are moving, but I've also got wind and bugs and all these other distractions. And but the more I did it, the more, I guess, the more acclimated or accustomed to it I became. And again, I don't remember the exact moment, but I could only get so much work done in a matter of a couple of hours, and by which time, the light was completely changed or something like that. And then it seemed to make sense that when I got it back to the studio, when I go back home, I could finish things up in the painting that I wasn't able to do right there on the spot. So, and with time, I became more comfortable with that, and gained more confidence. So I could tell myself, well, I've painted clouds so many times. I think I know how to paint a cloud. I can invent this a little bit. And eventually I was able to just kind of make them up. So, but it's that kind of thinking, or being familiar enough with the subject and having enough experience, and knowing enough about painting that have allowed me to grow as an artist. And I've been able to apply those lessons and that, I guess that idea, the one I just described to you, in most all of the work that I've been doing over the years. So, fast forward 10, 15 years after doing plein air painting, and I was working from photographs with of figures, something I had never really done before. And after doing it for a while and ruining a lot of canvases, same thing happened. I built up a level of confidence where I felt like I knew enough about drawing, I knew enough about looking at the figure, and I knew enough about painting in general that I felt comfortable that with being able to, or with inventing and making some things up, like color or something like that, which is, and all of those things are very important, especially when you're working from photos. And I get into this a lot with students when we talk about that, interpreting a photo as opposed to copying a photograph. So,
yeah.
But I think at the heart of all of what you're asking, the most important thing is knowing how to draw and how to paint and having it up here. Because if you know enough about painting and drawing, then it makes it much easier to interpret whether you have a subject right in front of you or whether you're working from a sketch or a photograph. In any scenario, in any of those scenarios, I am always trying to rely mostly on what I know about painting up here, and not as much when it comes to the reference, whether it be a photograph or a subject in front of me.
So would it be fair to say that you inject a kind of informed design in the interpretation beyond the copy, as you say, which would limit your ability to serve the image over the kind of original source material?
Yes, and I think good painters do that. Yes, I think most accomplished painters can do that. I use as an example photographs, and I talk about this a lot with students. I can usually tell when someone who doesn't have a lot of painting experience has used a photograph for a reference, because it looks like the painting starts to look like the photograph. And when I say looks like, I mean it basically has all of the flaws that the photograph has in it. Whereas the experienced painter knows how to navigate their way through that, and is not just relying on the information in the photograph, which is very often flawed anyway, but is able to create and invent something based on what they know about painting and drawing, so that they can come away with something that looks like a good painting, as opposed to a poorly copied photograph. And I think any painter, or all of the great painters throughout history, have always been able to do that, even if they weren't working from photographs hundreds of years ago. I whenever I get into a discussion with students about working from photos, and whether it's because for some it's a taboo subject, and I also came from that sort of a mindset when I was in school. You don't work from photographs, it's that's cheating. But I look at it this way, and I tell students this: if it's not as if the old masters, well, as an example, like if you had to paint a mural or a fresco, it's not, you're going to be using a sketch. It's not like you have the model right there on the scaffolding right next to you. So it makes sense that you have to be able to apply a certain amount of invention when you're working that way. You may have a sketch or a reference, but there has to be some, you have to be able to invent a little bit. You have to be able to, you may be inventing colors to some extent, so on and so forth. It's not as I said, it's not as if you're making some kind of a very literal replication of a model right next to you. And I'm convinced that a lot of that went on hundreds of years ago. And it seems to make sense to me whenever I look at paintings, having had the experience of having drawn and painted for so long, and getting or having a fairly good idea of how you create a large composition from a small sketch or a photo or something like that, and the mental process that you have to go through to create something from a small sketch. It just makes more sense to me now.
Yeah, so you can read the timeline of the work better. I mean, speaking of which, I think there are certain misconceptions about the purist approach to painting, being that something is conceptualized in its entirety before the paint starts to be applied. And my understanding is that there are certain discoveries and epiphanies that occur in the process of a painting. Is that your experience as well?
It is for my painting, but having said that, I think it's important to recognize that there are, my way of painting, or what I've just described to you, is but one way of painting. What I'm saying is yes, there are very more what would I say, very, let's say, call them traditionalists or purists, who have they have a different attitude, and that's fine. I don't have any problem with that. But I've heard some very accomplished painters say they just can't work from a photograph. They have to have that immediate connection to a subject or a model that's right in front of them. And I can understand that. If you have that point of view where you need that, then that's fine, and that makes sense, and I don't have any problem with that. It does take a different kind of a mentality, though, and a different way of thinking. If you're going to move away from that, because that's the way I thought like that when I was a student, and for many years after school, I was that kind of a purist. Like, no, I don't want to be removed from the subject right there in front of me, because there's something will be lost. But my attitude changed a lot. I'd say about 10 to 12 years out of art school, where I began to think a bit more outside of my comfort zone, and began trying different things that really challenged my preconceptions about what I was doing and what it meant to make, to be a good painter, and to make a good painting. So I began to think differently about that. And I think that probably any painter, or many, I should say, many painters do. Again, there are the traditionalists and the purists who want that experience of having, a subject right there in front of them, and they work from it that way. And that's kind of the way that a lot of the painters began painting during the Renaissance. I mean, it was about creating something that was as as realistic as they could possibly get, as far as creating this vision of the world the way they saw it. And then with time, over the centuries, there many changes started to happen, and the way that painters applied paint and the way that they interpreted things began to change a bit. So there are lots of different ways of approaching this, and as I said, mine is just one of them.
In my experience, photographs can have the effect of flattening a subject, and it takes experience and knowledge to go past that, where you would recognize a painting based on a photograph compared to a painting copying a photograph.
Right.
You'd recognize the copy where you wouldn't recognize something which is based on it, but injected with that knowledge and experience. Is this experimentation that you just mentioned something which you discuss with your students that is going to fill that gap for them between this conflict of in-person models or subjects and photographic reference?
Right. In fact, it's not, we talk about it not just in terms, it comes up whenever the word photo is mentioned, but it's also, it's not unique to working from photos, but it's also something that comes up when in a class where I'm just talking about interpreting a subject, whether it be a still life or a figure from a live model. So the thing that I like to talk about with students is that drawing and painting it's not simply a matter of trying to, you have a subject in front of you and you're just trying to copy and replicate all the lines and the darks and lights that you see in front of you. It's very much based on the having the knowledge. This goes back to what I was saying earlier about understanding drawing and painting, understanding light and shadow and so on and so forth, and having those tools, or having that under your belt, so that you know how to create a sense of volume and depth without even necessarily having to have them. If you can draw a sphere or a cube and you can shade it in and make it look three-dimensional, without having that in front of you necessarily, then you're probably, those wheels are already turning in your head. And I think that's an important thing to be able to do, because, and as I tell students, if you have that knowledge beforehand, then it informs you, or it informs what you're looking at, so that when I see a model or a subject in front of me, I already know, I have a preconceived idea in my head about things like, well, I know the light, if the light's coming from here or there or wherever, then the shadows will be here. And, I know what a core shadow looks like, and I know what it should look like, and I can anticipate it, so that I'm not just relying on what's in front of me as far as copying it, but I know beforehand what it's supposed to look like, and it makes it that much easier for me to interpret it and to anticipate it, when I see that in life. So an analogy I sometimes make is, when you have that knowledge, when there's both what you know about painting and what you're perceiving, when you have those two things working hand in hand, it's kind of like, the analogy I sometimes make is like, well, if you had to get into your car and go from point A to point B, having that knowledge is like having a map or GPS, as opposed to not having it. Because if you have the map and the GPS, then you know what's coming down the road. You have a better idea of what to anticipate and how you're going to handle it when you arrive at that point. It's a much more it's a much more effective way of getting from one point to another, and and then taking this back to the world of drawing and painting, it makes it easier, or opens up the possibilities for interpretation and for inventing and infusing your own sense of style or vision in what you're doing, because you know how to navigate this we'll call it a road, for lack of a better word. And but it takes time to develop that, and I always tell students that, so I'll say things like, think about what you're looking at first. Don't just start drawing or painting it, but you want to understand what it is that you're seeing, so that you have so that you can conceptualize it first, then actually paint or draw it. And that's a big issue with students, because they tend to just start drawing something without really seeing it objectively. They're drawing more subjectively, based on what they think something looks like, or what it's supposed to be here on the canvas, as opposed to really seeing and understanding it for what it is.
I had a close friend who was a bit of a mentor for me for some years, and she was very experienced, and she would say things like, we would always go to life drawing together. So she would host the class, but she wouldn't teach. Whereas after the class, her and I would go and talk about it for a few hours away from the class, and we'd talk about the ideas. And she got me onto this idea of, instead of sitting, looking, and then drawing, she said, if you're given 10 minutes, spend 5 minutes looking and then draw and see what happens. And she said those remaining 5 minutes will be far more well-informed than if you look for 1 minute and then you start drawing.
Exactly. And I've had students, when I've done demonstrations, they will point out, in fact, I guess I'm not even aware of this myself until someone else mentions it, but they'll say, when I watch you painting the demonstration, you stop and you're standing back and you're looking, and then you paint. And I think that's very important, because you're spending that time thinking. Like, as you said, so much of that is, the thinking and the seeing part, and then the actual, because that's probably half, if not more, than the more of the work or the process that's going on is the mental part. And then there's just the physical, well, I'm putting a piece of paint here now. I remember having a student who quoted a teacher they had who said something to the effect of, don't just do something, stand there. So stop, look, and think about what you're going to do, what's your plan of attack, or how are you going to approach this? And then you have, if you do that, you have a much better idea, or a much better chance at getting the right brushstroke, or getting something that looks the way you want it to look, rather than just, I'm reacting to what I'm seeing here. And I can't imagine. Well, early on, I probably did more painting like that, but or another person said something like, it's almost like, they said, when I'm watching you paint, sometimes you actually do like one or two sort of, you don't touch the paint to the canvas, but you're just kind of getting ready to do it. and they likened that to golf, like the way a golfer would sort of get
Practice
ready
swing.
to make that, that stroke.
Yeah, it is. It's great. Those motions are really important, isn't it? It's to engage your shoulder instead of just your wrist and things like that in order to,
Right,
uh,
right.
good rhythmic marks. I mean, um, I find all of this really, and so forgive me for kind of keeping digging into these things, but I do teaching on Saturdays, and I've found that if the class learns two things, they're related by the end of the class. Just two things. For the
Mhm.
whole thing, we're talking about different ideas, but if they take away just two insights, that will really lighten up their future of drawing and painting. And
Right.
for an example, one of the things which I mentioned is assuming that the light is from the above right-hand side of the model. Um,
Mhm.
Anything that goes inwards will catch shadow, and anything that sticks out will catch light. And the higher and more direct the surface is towards the source of light, the brighter the light will be. So the lower
Right,
down, the tonal values shift. And this is something
right.
which took them a while to gather, but it was as soon as they did understand what I meant about how all the tonal values shift as it goes down the subject, it became something which lit up their brain to that observation, and they looked around the room and looking at each other and noticing that. Is there anything like that which you can remember that you impart to your students, which you think people just don't realize these observations that we collect as artists throughout our years of
Mhm.
experience? Is there anything you can remember of that?
As it relates to, I don't know if I can specifically remember how it would relate to, say, a student. I can definitely, I can definitely remember as it relates to myself, or how I, as a student myself,
Yeah.
how when I was young, and when I was in school, when all of this was very new, um, and you're learning all these different things. You're learning how to actually see the way an artist sees, which I've realized now is very different than the way non-artists see things. And I think there's a lot at this point that I take for granted because I've been seeing the world through an artist's eyes for a long time now. So sometimes when I have when I have a student and I look at what they're doing, and I point something out, or I fix something on a painting, which can be very minor, and they're flabbergasted because they say, "Oh, that's amazing!" Like one little thing, and it makes such a difference. And I think I understand why this is what I'm about to say, but sometimes I have to remind myself, well, I've been painting for over 40 years. I graduated from art school 40 years ago. And sometimes I have to, when I see a student, or I wonder, how do they not see what I'm what I'm seeing? That sounds silly as I mention it, but and I do have to remind myself, but think back to when I was a student and how these things were all new and I had not yet discovered them, or really integrated them into the way that I think and see.
Mm,
Um, it's it's a strange, it's kind of a strange process when I think about it.
mm,
The fact that something can become so seemingly second nature, um, and then I think, wow, how long has it been since I've been doing this? And so going back to what you were asking before, when I was a student, I can remember when all of these things were new, I could be, for instance, everything was a potential painting to me. I would be looking at any number of things and thinking, oh, look at the way the light hits that person over there, or the way it hits that building or that tree over there. And suddenly everything becomes a painting, or the process of painting. Even if you don't have a sketchbook in front of you, or you're not actually painting. I could be I remember I might be riding a bus or the train, or just going about my daily life and seeing these things and practicing all of those things in my head. So in other words, I was drawing and painting, not literally, but as a mental exercise, and learning all of those things that I think I take for granted, and that I try to talk about and teach to students. And it's very fascinating the way we learn things like that. Not just painting, but the way we learn any number of things, and how you can become adept at doing it. And then years later, you have to think back to when I didn't know how to do that, or even having even speech or language is something that's, it's this very complex thing that's going on in your brain. But, as a child, you're not as good at it, because it takes time to learn these things. And painting is just a language. Yeah. It's just a different vocabulary anyway.
Yeah, it feels like a gift to be able to walk around seeing things in paint. And my experience has been, no matter how many plein air paintings I've done, when I walk around, I still make discoveries, because I won't have painted in these conditions. And for an example, I was once walking to a garage to pick up my car, and it started raining. And I was getting really wet, but I thought, this is an opportunity to look at the environment. And I'd made assumptions about puddles, that they would be light. And then I had the realization, when I started to observe them, that they are mirrors of my vantage points at the street. So it would be light and dark, and it would be reflecting the buildings and the sky and whatever was there to be a mirror for that image.
Right.
I'd assumed incorrectly. Really.
Yeah. Like, as you said, at this point in my life, I've kind of lost track of what it was like before I was an artist, or before I had very, I guess, highly developed sense of visual understanding. I can't imagine at this point not seeing things the way that I see them. I remember a friend of mine, an artist friend. I think she was we have a group of friends who come to my studio on Saturday, and we have a model, and we all paint together. But so we're always talking about painting and drawing, and I think a friend was talking about how she would maybe she was going for a walk with a friend of hers, but the other friend, the friend would become annoyed every time my friend would stop and say, "Oh, look at that X, Y, or Z," because that's the way artists, that's the way we see things. And, we stop and we look at these things like, look at that cloud, or to someone else that might be completely boring and just get in the way of, going from, like, we're trying to walk from here to there.
Yeah.
Could we not do that right now?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. My friend would always say, "Where's the light coming from?" Whenever we were somewhere, she'd say, "Where's the light on this subject?" And to try and find where the lightest part of a mid environment would be, or what color would you use for, would you mix this?
Right.
Which I love those conversations. It really makes you analyze the subtlety of light and color. and how those things can be affected by the surrounding colors, which are very interesting.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Is that something which you teach as well? Is that the kind of interplay between colors once you've covered a canvas, how everything shifts? Because as soon as you've covered up either the white of the canvas or the ground which you've put down, you've now got a different patchwork of tones to work with.
Right. Another big topic that I find myself discussing with students is context and relationships of whether it be value or color, and how, or the way I would describe it, I would often say value slash color, it doesn't exist in a vacuum by itself. It is very much dependent and related to what's going on around it. One value or one color seem or appear the way they do very much based on what's around it. So it's all they're just as notes in a scale are they exist in a context in which each note is related to the one next to it and before it and in the whole scale. The same goes for value and color in a painting. It's if something's not quite right, if one color is off or it doesn't really make sense with within the context of that painting, then it's almost like hearing maybe a musical note that's like a little out of tune or something. It doesn't belong there, and you'd say, oh, that doesn't sound right. Now, not all students recognize that at first, but I find myself often talking about that or pointing that out with students. A big issue would be, for instance, the amount of contrast, light and dark, in a painting. A lot of students, I don't think that their vision is quite fine-tuned enough so that they can always discern that. But so I find myself sometimes going up to a student and saying, well, if this light is as light as that, and that light looks right based on the subject in front of you, but then there's this dark, it's too dark, it's too great a contrast, and it's not it's not really in harmony with the amount of light that you have there, and that's what we're trying to do. We need all these tones and values to be in harmony with one another so that they make sense.
That's an important principle.
Yeah.
I'm often interested in how the listeners or viewers of the podcast feel about, I think a lot of artists wonder about what to paint, how to pick a subject. And obviously I'm not encouraging them to copy any of our guests or any other person, but what do you look for in a subject when you have a model, or what's important to you that you look for in one of your subjects?
Well, that's a really good question. Lighting, I'd say, is very important to me. That's one of the first things I tend to notice. And then there's the actual subject itself. Like, do I want to paint that subject or this subject or whatever the case may be? So I guess there's a couple of things that would go through my mind. The first would be a subject that excites me for whatever reason, and that can vary depending on what stage I'm in or what mood I'm in, or one day it might be a landscape, or another day it might be, I want to paint this figure. So once you've established that, then, of course, then there's the whole, well, how do I represent this? What kind of light, the light in the painting or in the subject, that would be an important part of it. And sometimes that can be a very big challenge, because you might have an idea in your head about, I want to do a subject that looks like this. How do you bring that to, how do you realize that? How do you actually create that and bring something to life? Which is, one of the things that astonishes me whenever I've looked at paintings throughout history. And I remember I've taught in England a number of times, and so I've traveled to England and to London, and one of my favorite museums, I think I've realized, is the National Gallery in London. And I've been there a number of times, and it may have been the last time, which was last summer, or the time before that, but I can remember looking at some old master paintings, some Italian Renaissance paintings. I think they were by maybe Veronese. And there are these huge canvases with all of these figures in them. And I'm thinking, yeah, how in the world, how do you go about? Okay, so you would have an idea in your head about, well, it's going to be this subject. It's usually some, a story from the Bible or some mythological story or something like that. But then, how did they come up with these things? Like, how do you decide on a composition? And, especially if you've got a painting that's got 30, 40 figures in it. To me, it's mind-boggling, actually, to me. Maybe that's getting a little bit too in depth, though, for the question that you were asking. But for me, I have to be excited by a subject. It's got to be something that means something, or that has some meaning, or something about something, some sense of, there has to be a sense of excitement, because if I don't feel enthused about it, it's really, it would be difficult to do it. So yeah, so these days I'm very much I'm looking for something that I find compelling, and that lends itself to the kind of painting that I'm doing right now. So, and then you have to kind of narrow it down to, okay, now I need to have a reference. I have to have photo or whatever, or a model, and I have to light it this way, and then you go from there. But given the way that I paint now, once I've got that established, then there's still a lot that's open-ended, and that is, how do I put it? This is where the pure, I and the purist kind of diverge.
Is the word
because the pure,
you're looking for?
What's that?
Unresolved, is that what you're looking for?
Oh, well, there's going to be more inventing and say improvisation in the way I go about it, and experimenting. Whereas, somebody who's much more traditional will have their subject and they've got it all mapped out from A to Z. And whereas with me, again, another musical analogy, I make a lot of musical analogies, but say if you were to, it's kind of like jazz versus classical music, whereas classical music is basically played nearly exactly as it's written. Jazz would be, more heavily based on improvisation. You have an idea, and there's sort of like an underlying structure, but then there's a lot of improvisation that goes on top of that. And I think that's kind of the way I think of approaching a lot of the painting that I do now is starting and thinking, well, this is a big experiment, and we'll see. I have an idea of where it's going to go, but I don't have it 100%. It's not 100% mapped out. I don't know. I don't know how this is going to look exactly, and I'm going to find out as I'm painting it. And that's what keeps me enthused and excited about my painting. It's also very nerve-wracking, and I find it very, it's difficult. It's a difficult way to paint for me because you don't know exactly. I can do paintings sometimes depending on what kind of a, a mood I'm in, or what I'm trying to achieve. I could do a painting where I know the process and I know, okay, I'll start A and then I'll go to B and then C, and I know how this is going to end up. There are those kinds of paintings. And then there are the ones that have a lot more, where there's a lot more, there's more experimentation. So I don't know exactly how the whole process will go. And it's harder. It's harder for me. I feel like it requires more thinking, and it can be a little nerve-wracking because I don't necessarily know exactly how I'm going about it. But I usually know when I like it, and that's what I'm looking for.
Yeah.
It's a very different way of thinking, though. That kind of an approach.
Mm.
But it's something that I feel like I need to do in order to keep myself excited and engaged about what I'm doing.
Yeah, it seems like an important element of the process. And if it were all mapped out for you, it may lose some of that energy that you inject into each piece that you do. Is that fair to say?
Right. And right, or at least that's where I am at this stage of my career.
Mm.
My painting was much more, we'll say, mapped out. It was much more, there was more of a preconceived idea of how it would turn out early on, whereas now it's a little bit, it's definitely more experimental.
Mm.
There's definitely more experimentation in the
Mm.
process from start to finish.
One of the things we like to get into on the channel, and it's important for me to ask you, is what is your color palette? Do you have a set palette? And if so, can you take us through what colors you use?
Right. I have a set palette. Okay. I think it's about I haven't counted it in a while. Maybe not quite a dozen colors. There's titanium white. And then I have a few cadmiums. I have cadmium red, cadmium yellow, and a cadmium orange, alizarin crimson, burnt sienna, yellow ochre. I'm having to mentally, I have it in the palette's way over there. And then I have an ultramarine blue. I have a purple, a dioxazine purple. A few greens. I have an olive green, and then a couple of cooler greens, like a viridian. And I have a raw umber. I don't use black, but raw umber is dark, my dark color. If I need something that's like a black, I would mix raw umber with some blue or some of the purple, and you get a pretty intense, pretty dark color.
So
That's pretty much all of them.
so all of, because I was thinking that's, except for the blue, aside from the blue, it seems like a split primary with some earth tones and greens.
Right.
Is that a conscious approach, or is that something which is developed through necessity or through preference?
I think it's developed. Well, it's a little of each, but I'd say I would describe it as those colors have been on my palette for quite a while, and they've evolved over the years. I think that the olive green is a holdover from when I used to paint landscape, plein air. But I find that it works very nicely in the darks of flesh tones. So it's on my palette, and I'm very accustomed to using it. So I keep it there. You know, every painter has different colors they may use. And I've gotten accustomed to having those specific colors to arrive at my, you know, in order to arrive at the colors that I'm trying to mix. But yeah, it has evolved over many years. I can't remember how long it's been since I changed or added a new color. It's been quite a while. So I've been using that palette for a long time.
Fantastic. No, it's interesting. It's always interesting to hear how artists use a palette to describe the world through their eyes and what they find reliable. So it's always something we like to discuss a little bit, but it's also, before we get too late, because I could talk to you for another hour, but I don't have another hour, sadly. So I'm going to push to the last couple of questions, and one of which is, what is your relationship with galleries? Do you exhibit in galleries, and how have you found working with galleries if you do?
Okay. I don't, presently, I only have one, potentially one other one I'm beginning to work with. But for the last few years, I've had but one gallery. I used to in the past. I would say in the late 1990s and early 2000s, I was a lot more involved with commercial galleries. That is something that for me, you're opening a can of worms, actually. But yes, I did. I used to work with a lot of commercial galleries. I don't so much now, and that's not a bad thing, because I think I kind of overdosed on the whole thing, and there are a lot of things about having to work with an art dealer or art galleries that I think run counter to my my personality. And it's the whole process of working with, in a nutshell, it's the reality of producing a commodity and then having to, you know, hand it over to salespeople. And it really is at at its core. Yes, it's art, but it is a commodity like any other commodity. So I think I became very frustrated with that, and over, I'd say, the last 8 or 9 years, I've gradually moved away from commercial galleries. A couple of things have happened. I haven't had as much success with commercial galleries, even the ones that where I used to exhibit, and they stopped for whatever reason selling my work. But also, I haven't been pursuing it either. I haven't really been. So, and I've realized that I think for both my mental health and my blood pressure, I'm probably better off teaching and being around people, other artists who are more interested in, you know, in learning to paint and being around those kinds of people, as opposed to in the whole world of, you know, commercial galleries and having to deal with the idea or the concept or the reality that, you know, I produce this painting, which is very near and dear to my heart, and then I hand it off to an art dealer, and then I have no control over it after that. And by which point now it's just basically become a commodity. And having to accept or deal with the fact that, you know, someone who buys a work of art could be, there's so many different reasons why they might be buying it, most of which probably have absolutely nothing to do with why I painted the painting in the first place. You know, there's everything from, once in a while you might encounter collectors who really see something in a painting, and they can relate to it on a you know, on a deeper level. But a lot of the time you're just having to deal with people who say, well, oh, well, that red in that painting matches my sofa, so that's why I want the painting. I guess I haven't been very good at dealing with that. So,
No, I understand that.
and that's just the reality of, you know, of working with commercial galleries.
Yeah, the marketplace.
Right, the marketplace.
Yeah. Well, for anyone who's watching or listening, where should they go to see your work, either in person or online? Where would you like people to go to support you and see your work and purchase it?
Well, um, the easiest thing to do is really to go to my social media, whether it be, you know, Instagram or Facebook or my website, davidshevlino.com. I do exhibit with a gallery in California, in the San Francisco area. The gallery is andranoris.com. You can also see it online at websites like, what are they called? Artsy and First Dibs. And there you can see my work there as well.
Fantastic.
But yeah, social media is I think these days probably social media is the way that most of the world is seeing what we creative people are doing.
Yeah. Well, the links for all of those will be in the description of the video or the description of the audio for the podcast, wherever you're finding it. We do encourage the listeners and viewers to go and support the artists, see their work. It's beautiful work. I'm a big fan of it, and I really appreciate you being so generous with your time and being on the podcast. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for asking some good questions.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much. Well, we hope you enjoyed that episode. If you can support the podcast by leaving a like or a comment down below, that would really be great. But what we'd really like is if you're able to leave a review on the podcast channels, wherever you listen to it or download it, because that helps us get spread around the internet so that more people have access to us and able to see what we're making.
Also, follow us on Instagram, and we'd really appreciate it if you like and engage with our posts. Help get the podcast better known. Thanks for listening.